With just a week between the French and British Grand Prix, there was relatively little news to report, though, unknown to most at that point, a delivery driver at a water treatment plant in the northern Cornish town of Camelford accidentally emptied his load of 20 tons of aluminium sulfate into the wrong tank. The chemical went directly into the town's water supply, raising the concentration to 2,000 times the maximum allowable amount, reacting with the water to produce sulfuric acid, which in turn stripped all kinds of further contaminants off the inside of the piping. It was the worst mass poisoning event in British history, with some 20,000 local people and 10,000 tourists visiting the enormously popular Cornish coast affected. Despite complaints about both the taste of the water and a series of health issues, including diarrhea and vomiting, blistering skin, and even hair turning blue and green, the water company insisted absolutely nothing was wrong for over 10 days, and even today no proper long-term study has been done on the health effects. Cinemagoers, meanwhile, were enjoying the biggest blockbuster hit of the summer, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the apparently seamless mixture of live action and animation, even reawakening interest in classic Hollywood cartoons. While other films released in 1988 included Tom Hanks in Big, fantasy adventure Willow, Die Hard, yes, it's a Christmas movie, yes, it was released in July, semi-python comedy A Fish Called Wanda, Tom Cruise drama Cocktail, Eddie Murphy vehicle Coming to America, Brat Pack Western Young Guns, Kevin Costner's baseball movie Bull Durham, and a slew of sequels including Crocodile Dundee 2, Arthur 2, On the Rocks, Short Circuit 2, The Deadpool, the fifth and final Dirty Harry movie, Caddyshack 2, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, and Poltergeist 3. And so to Silverstone, the track celebrating its 40th anniversary with a new press centre, hospitality tent and big screens around the track showing the BBC's live broadcast feed. Even with only a week between races, many teams were at their home track and had chance to make some tweaks to their cars. McLaren changed out their turbo inlets and intercooler setup for ones more suitable for the faster tracks here and in Germany. Judd had a new higher compression engine available, and the March team had some new nose aerodynamics. Tyrrell, meanwhile, announced that Chief Engineer Maurice Philippe would be departing to make way for the incoming Harvey Postlethwaite. But the big news, of course, was Nigel Mansell's press conference, announced in France the previous weekend, in which he confirmed, as many had rumoured, that he would be joining Ferrari next year. Mansell would be replacing Alboreto, who said in an interview that he might be driving for an English team next year but wouldn't be drawn further. Some thought he might swap places with Mansell, but other possible destinations were Benetton or his former employer Ken Tyrrell. That done, the team took to the track. After this race, the halfway point of the season, one team would be lifted out of pre-qualifying and one team drop in. On current form, it would be Real who could look forward to a bit more of a lie-in. Andrea de Cesaris celebrated by being 1.5 seconds clear of next best Caffi in pre-qualifying, while Gabriele Tarquini made it 3 DNPQs in a row for Coloni. Friday's times were interesting. Alboreto was fastest, and Berger second, while the McLaren's amendment seemed to have adversely affected the balance, and Prost and Senna both struggled, though they still managed third and fourth. Mansell, meanwhile, was back in 13th on home soil, slower than de Cesaris, and Patrese was slowest of all in 30th, having only managed to lap nearly 20 seconds off Alboreto. The problem, as usual, was the suspension, so on Friday night Patrick Head bit the bullet and made the decision to can the reactive suspension system entirely and build a whole new passive suspension for both cars overnight. As he told an interviewer the next morning, "It's a bodge, frankly. We've put steel mechanical springs and dampers on, we've changed the front struts into dampers, designed some new bits and pieces which we machined up overnight, we did some new pistons for the front struts. It's a bit of a bodge, as I said." So under grey skies and a whipping wind, Saturday qualifying proved an entertaining hour, which ended up with Ferrari still on top, Berger in pole ahead of Alboreto, with Senna and Prost on row 2 half a second back. On row 3 was a surprise. The March cars of Gugelmin and Capelli, their new aero and improved engine apparently making quite a difference. Piquet was 7th alongside Nannini, with Warwick and Nakajima making up the top 10. Mansell had improved to 11th alongside Boutsen, with Patrese 15th alongside his 1987 teammate de Cesaris, but safely qualified. Streff had come away from Paul Ricard with some nasty fuel burns, but was able to put the AGS 16th. Arnoux managed to qualify in 25th, but Stefan Johansson continued his awful season with another DNQ, alongside Larrauri and both Zach Speeds. The fans packed into Silverstone as usual, despite little real chance of a British victory this year, and despite the weather looking distinctly iffy. But this is Britain in July, and rain is almost expected. By the time of the race on Sunday afternoon, the heavens had opened, and for the first time since Senna's debut win in Portugal in 1985, a wet race was declared. The soggy fans were delighted. This could really narrow the gap between the turbo and atmospheric cars and give their man Mansell a chance to do well, and even if he didn't, it could certainly upset the form book and give someone other than McLaren a chance to win, especially with the balance problems Team Perfect were having this weekend. So they lined up on the grid as Palmer dived in with an engine problem from the parade lap to start from the pit lane, assuming they could get him going again at all, and away they went, with the two Ferraris both getting away strongly, while Gugelmin got ahead of Prost into 4th as the rest were engulfed in a ball of spray. Senna quickly got ahead of Alboreto into 2nd, and then unsuccessfully challenged Berger for the lead at Stowe, while his teammate Prost was having all sorts of problems, losing places on lap 1 to Capelli, Nannini and Mansell. So, now the position from the last few races was reversed as Senna hung on Berger's rear wing as Sala biffed Streff in the spray and wound up in a gravel trap with no nose cone. Palmer was eventually released from the pits, just in time to be lapped by the leaders at the end of lap 2, and Alboreto was already dropping back. Behind him were the two marches of Gugelmin and Capelli, with Nannini 6th and Mansell 7th and charging. Capelli started having some electrical problems and dropped back, promoting Mansell into the points, but in the conditions most drivers seemed to be tiptoeing and hoping the conditions would improve later on rather than charging now. Senna was still with Berger and already 11 seconds ahead of Alboreto by lap 5. Gugelmin was running well in 4th, the highest he'd been in a Grand Prix, but Nannini was now nipping at his heels, a little held up, but unable to find a place to pass, especially as the rain had eased off and a slightly less wet line was beginning to appear, and venturing off it to take a look down the inside made Sandro even slower. Behind them, Mansell had caught up too, and a three-way battle had developed. Streff's rear wing, meanwhile, had been damaged in his coming together with Sala, and he held it on the road for a while before finally giving up after 8 laps, and De Cesaris trailed in with a broken clutch a lap later, but otherwise the running order had settled down as the leaders came round to lap Arnoux and some more backmarkers. The battle over 4th began to catch Alboreto, as Nannini was still looking for a way past Gugelmin, impatiently dodging out from behind where there wasn't really much chance of overtaking, and in turn allowing Mansell to have a go at him. The four all streamed past Laurini's Azella, Mansell now nipping at Nannini's heels. While the cameras were concentrating on that, the leaders came up to lap a struggling Prost, running 16th, and Senna pulled out and passed Berger for the lead, as well as his teammate. Prost was so discombobulated that he lost another place to Alex Caffey in the process. So on lap 16, Senna now led Berger as a dry, or at least drier, line was beginning to develop. Berger wasn't going to be left behind though, and was doggedly holding on. Of course, no sooner were we watching the leaders again than Nannini and Mansell both finally found a way past Gugelmin, dropping him rapidly to 6th, with his teammate Capelli still 7th. Such was the leader's pace that by lap 19 of the scheduled 65, Senna was already lapping 12th place Patrese and was approaching Piquet and Cheever 10th and 11th. The BBC left the cameras running at the end of lap 20 to illustrate the gap between Berger and Alboreto, now up to 41 seconds. As the number 27 Ferrari now had Nannini and Mansell, who'd be driving that car next year, tucked right up behind him. As they all came up to lap Martini, Mansell pulled out and tried to do a Senna and pass both, but Alboreto held his line, Mansell tucked in behind, and Nannini spun, dropping behind the marchers as he recovered smartly. So now it was Mansell right behind Alboreto, scenting a famous podium visit at his home race after a dreadful season so far. On lap 23, he pulled out and took 3rd, as a recovering Nannini had repassed Gugelmin off camera and was now catching Mansell and Alboreto again. Senna up front, meanwhile, was now 4 seconds ahead of Berger, but he'd been told by McLaren to ease off as he was using fuel at too high a rate. His teammate Prost came in after 24 laps to retire, completely fed up with the handling of his car, his first DNF of the year. The rain was still holding off and the dry line was beginning to become a problem as the wet weather tyres started to heat up and degrade. Some drivers, including Mansell, were going offline to find wetter patches to cool the tyres, but it looked like unless the rain started again soon, there might have to be some tyre stops, which might shake things up. Nannini had got past Alboreto too and was now firmly stuck to Mansell's rear wing. When Nigel went to cool his tyres on lap 27, Sandro was through into third. The Benetton's brake balance was a little out though, and he was struggling a bit to keep it pointed the right way on the slippery surface. He still managed to put up the fastest lap on lap 29, just in time to spin again. Luckily, the sand trap was just as wet as everything else, so he only lost 1 place, rejoining the track showering bits of grit everywhere. Behind them, Alboreto was now having to fend off the flying march of Gugelmin. It wasn't long before Michele ran a little wide at bridge and Maurizio was through into 5th, just as Capelli peeled in from 9th to change 1 tyre. He was back in a lap later to retire with a dud alternator. It was just after half distance, and car problems aside, it looked pretty clear that Senna and Berger were going to be the top two here, with the Brazilian nearly 16 seconds ahead of the Austrian on lap 35, with third place Mansell another 42 seconds back, and now safe from Nannini for the moment. Senna, having lapped 7th place Piquet, was also moving over to cool his tyres, but that dry line was getting more pronounced, and teams were starting to look at changing to slicks. But it was still a brave decision right now, with the track wet off the racing line. As the race approached 2/3 distance, Boutsen retired from 8th, just the 6th retirement, with transmission trouble that caused a minor oil fire. Derek Warwick thus moved up to take his place, with Nakajima, Chiva, Patrese and Caffi next in the order. Piquet, meanwhile, had moved ahead of Alboreto into 6th place, as Berger's pit board told him to slow, so it seemed as if, once again, even at a wet race, fuel consumption was becoming an issue for Ferrari. Slow Berger had, because Mansell was now cutting lumps out of his lead, reeling him in at 2 seconds a lap with a 30-second gap now to overcome with 20 laps to go. Mansell was clearly enjoying himself, finally comfortable in the car now the troublesome suspension had been replaced, and roared on by the crowd who were alternately willing Mansell on and wishing calamity on Senna and Berger. Mansell took another 10 seconds out of Berger on the next 3 laps, putting up the fastest lap on lap 46 as the Ferrari mechanics started setting out some slick tyres. They were for Alboreto, who came in with little to lose and hoping he'd get an advantage by being the first to make the switch. He was being keenly watched by everyone else to see how it would play out, while Piquet, who'd husbanded his tyres earlier in the race, had re-caught Senna and was angling at unlapping himself. Senna, for his part, was driving cautiously with a big lead, now 49 seconds ahead of Berger, and waiting on his team's decision about tyres. Mansell, with no fuel worries, was still flying, now just 4 seconds behind Berger on lap 49, setting a new fastest lap, and before long Nigel was right up with his future teammate, still darting across to take the wetter line whenever he could. To a roar from the crowd, Mansell pulled out and passed Berger into second, just as it started spitting with rain again, which just added to everyone's tyre dilemma. A fuming Berger, still having to plod along to conserve fuel, rapidly fell behind Nannini and Gugelmin too. Alboreto came back in to switch to wets, thoroughly wrecking his race, as Piquet unlapped himself from a cruising Senna, and Alboreto capped off the weekend by running out of fuel 3 laps from home. Berger dropped further back in the closing stages, lapped by Senna on the last lap, before running dry on the very last corner to lose 6th place to Warwick, with Patrese and Chiva also piling past. So Senna took his 4th win of the year, with Mansell taking an unexpected, welcome and very popular 2nd place, his first finish of the year, and Judd's first podium as an engine supplier. Alessandro Nannini wrestled his Benetton to the end in 3rd to taste podium champagne for the first time. Gugelmin scored his career first points after a fine drive to 4th, with Piquet and Warwick being the beneficiaries of that thirsty Ferrari engine. Another low attrition race saw just 7 retirements, plus Alboreto and Larini, both running dry towards the end but still classified. So at the halfway point of the season, Prost still led Senna on points, with 4 wins apiece, with Piquet reclaiming his 4th spot from Alboreto, while McLaren had already broken 100 points, and Ferrari on 34 were just as convincingly second, with more points than the next two teams put together. The most the Maranello faithful will have taken away from a soggy Silverstone, though, is that they'll be looking forward to seeing Mansell in a Ferrari next year.